At 58, after 33 years of marriage, Ruth Macklin walked out of a courtroom with a cardboard box, a rusted pickup truck, and the deed to her father's gas station on a mountain road. It was the only asset her husband's lawyers hadn't bothered to fight for. Dennis kept the house, the savings, and the woman he'd been seeing for years. Ruth drove 4 hours into the Blue Ridge with $200 in her checking account. The station had been closed since her father died. His reading glasses still sat on the counter beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. She'd come to sell the place and move on, but when she pried open the panel behind the register, she found something Earl Macklin had spent 40 years quietly building, something the entire valley remembered, even if his own daughter never knew. The courtroom smelled like floor polish and stale air. Ruth sat in a wooden chair while a judge read settlement terms into a microphone that made his voice sound like it was coming through a tin can. Dennis wasn't there. He'd sent his attorney, a man named Felton in a charcoal suit who kept checking his watch. Some men take your house. Some men take your name. Dennis Macklin took 33 years and called it a fair split. Ruth signed where Felton pointed. 4 signatures, 2 initials, and her marriage was a stack of documents in a manila folder. The attorney slid a single sheet across the table. This is the asset schedule. The Briar Creek property, vehicles, retirement accounts, and investment portfolio remain with Mr. Macklin per the terms of the agreement. You retain the Ford pickup, personal effects, and the real property located at Route 11, Goshen County. The real property. That was what they called her father's gas station, a building she hadn't seen in over a decade, on a mountain road she barely remembered how to find. Dennis's lawyers had appraised it at $14,000 and let her keep it without argument. A rounding error on his balance sheet. Ruth picked up the cardboard box from under the table. Inside were the things Dennis had left on the kitchen counter for her to collect. A jewelry box her mother had given her. A photo album from Connie's childhood. A coffee mug that said "World's Best Mom" with a chip on the rim. 33 years of marriage, and this is what fit in a single box. She walked to the parking lot and set the box in the bed of the truck. The Ford was a 2006 model with 160,000 miles, a cracked dashboard, and a passenger door that stuck. Dennis had bought it for the landscaper who quit after 2 weeks. It sat in their driveway for years until Ruth started using it for errands. When the divorce was final, Dennis told his lawyer she could keep it. Generous, Ruth sat behind the wheel for a long time. She had nowhere to go. The house on Briar Creek was Dennis's now, officially, though it had stopped being hers long before the papers were signed. She had no apartment, no job, no friends who weren't really Dennis's friends. $211 in a checking account that would soon have only her name on it. She pulled the deed from the folder on the passenger seat. The paper was old, creased from being stored in a file cabinet at the county clerk's office. Macklin Gas and Service, Route 11, Goshen County. Deeded to Ruth Ann Macklin per the last will and testament of Earl Robert Macklin, deceased. Her father had left her the station when he died 12 years ago. She'd driven down for the funeral, spent 3 days sorting through his things, then locked the door and never went back. Dennis said the property wasn't worth the taxes, and Ruth hadn't argued. She never argued with Dennis about money, about decisions, about anything. That was the deal, though nobody ever said it out loud. He earned. She agreed. For 33 years. Ruth turned the key in the ignition. The engine caught on the 3rd try, coughing before settling into a rough idle. She pulled out of the courthouse parking lot and pointed the truck south toward the mountains. The drive took 4 hours. Interstate gave way to 2-lane highway, which gave way to county road, which gave way to Route 11, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that climbed into the Blue Ridge through tunnels of oak and hickory. The trees were just beginning to turn, edges of gold and copper bleeding through the green. Ruth cracked the window and let the mountain air fill the cab. It smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke, and underneath that, something older, rock and soil and time. She remembered this road from summers as a girl. Her mother would drop her at the station in June and pick her up in August. 2 months with Earl, learning to pump gas and make change and check oil levels. He taught her to read a tire tread, to listen to an engine and hear what was wrong. She could change a fan belt by the time she was 12. Dennis found that amusing when they first dated. Later, he found it embarrassing. A real estate developer's wife who knew her way around a carburetor. He never said she should stop. He just stopped asking about it, and eventually she stopped doing it the way you stop doing anything when the person closest to you pretends it doesn't exist. Route 11 climbed higher, the trees thickening around the road. Ruth passed a few houses, a church with a gravel parking lot, a general store with a closed sign. Then the road curved around a granite outcrop. And there it was, Macklin Gas and Service. The station was smaller than she remembered, a single-story cinder block building with a flat roof and 2 gas pump islands out front. The pumps were locked and rusted, their price displays frozen on numbers from another decade. Kudzu had crawled over the south wall and was reaching for the roof. The sign above the door, hand-painted by Earl himself, had faded to ghosts of letters. One of the front windows had a crack running corner to corner, sealed with duct tape that had long since dried and curled. But the building was standing. The walls were solid. The door, when Ruth tried it, was locked tight. She fished through the cardboard box until she found the ring of keys from the manila folder. The second key fit the front door. The lock resisted, then turned with a gritty click. Inside, the air was still and thick with dust. Late afternoon light filtered through the dirty windows, casting pale rectangles across the concrete floor. A wooden counter ran along the back wall. Behind it, a pegboard hung with hooks that once held snack bags and road maps. The cash register, an old mechanical one with actual buttons, sat in the center of the counter, its drawer slightly open. And beside the register, exactly where he'd left them, sat Earl's reading glasses, wire-rimmed, one temple slightly bent. Next to them, a folded newspaper open to the crossword puzzle. 27 across was filled in with his careful block letters. 28 across was blank. Ruth picked up the glasses and held them. The lenses were dusty but unbroken. She cleaned them with the hem of her shirt, a reflex from childhood when she used to hand them back to him after he'd misplaced them for the 3rd time in an afternoon. She set them back on the counter and looked around. The station was one large room with the counter dividing the front from a small stockroom in back. To the right, a door led to the repair bay, a 2-car garage attached to the main building. To the left, a narrow staircase climbed to the apartment above, where Earl had lived for the last 20 years of his life, after Ruth's mother passed. Ruth climbed the stairs. The apartment was cramped but intact. A bed with a bare mattress, a dresser, a small kitchen with a 2-burner stove, and a refrigerator that hummed faintly when she plugged it in. The bathroom had a stand-up shower and a medicine cabinet still stocked with Earl's toothbrush and a bottle of aspirin that had expired 8 years ago. She opened the single window above the bed. Mountain air rushed in, pushing out the staleness. From up here, she could see Route 11 curving down the mountain, and beyond it, ridge lines layered in blue and gray, fading into the distance. Ruth sat on the mattress. The springs creaked under her weight. She was 58 years old, sitting in her dead father's apartment above a closed gas station on a road nobody used anymore. With $200 in a cardboard box and no plan, she didn't cry. She'd done her crying weeks ago, alone in the guest bedroom of the house on Briar Creek while Dennis slept in the master suite with the door locked. The crying was finished. What she felt now was quieter than grief. Emptier. She went back downstairs as the light was fading. The station felt different in the dimness, less abandoned and more waiting. She walked behind the counter and ran her hand along its surface, feeling the grooves and scratches from decades of use. Her fingers found a seam in the wood paneling below the register. Not a crack, a seam, straight and deliberate. Ruth knelt down. The panel was about 2 feet square, fitted flush against the wall but not nailed. She worked her fingernails into the edge and pulled. It came away with a dry scrape, revealing a shallow cavity in the wall. Inside was a leather journal, thick and soft-covered, held closed with a rubber band, a metal lockbox, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store, and a bundle of envelopes bound with kitchen twine. Ruth's hands trembled as she lifted the journal out. The leather was worn smooth at the edges, darkened where fingers had gripped it thousands of times. She slid off the rubber band and opened it to the first page. Earl's handwriting, small, neat, slanting slightly to the right, dated September 14th, 1981. Lent Tom Hendricks $200 for the electric bill. Wife is due in March, and they can't afford to lose heat. Told him to pay when he can. He won't be able to, but that's all right. Ruth turned the page. Fixed Carol Dunbar's transmission. Charged her $30 for parts, nothing for labor. She's raising 3 kids alone since Ray left. The oldest one helped me sweep the bay while Carol waited. Good kid. Quiet. Page after page, entry after entry. Names, amounts, reasons. Every loan, every free repair, every bag of groceries slipped into someone's truck while they weren't looking. Spanning decades, hundreds of entries in Earl's careful hand, each one a record of a kindness he never mentioned to anyone. Ruth sat on the floor behind the counter, reading by the last light coming through the windows. Earl had kept a running account of every family in the valley, not their debts but their needs. He noted when children were born, when someone lost a job, when a roof needed patching. He tracked the loans some people paid back and quietly forgave the ones they couldn't. She opened the lockbox. Inside was $412 in small bills, a set of keys she didn't recognize, and a folded document that turned out to be the original deed to the property passed down from Earl's father. The envelopes were harder to open. Her hands shook as she untied the twine. There were 8 of them, each addressed in different handwriting, all to Earl. Thank you notes. One from a woman named Linda, whose family would have lost their farm without Earl's help. One from a man named Curtis, who said Earl's $50 loan got him through the worst month of his life. Simple letters, written on notebook paper and the backs of receipts, expressing gratitude for acts of generosity that Earl had never spoken about, not even to his own daughter. Ruth kept reading. The journal entries grew more recent, the handwriting shakier. The last quarter of the book covered the final years of Earl's life, when the station was slowing down and fewer cars stopped on Route 11. But even then, Earl was still lending, still fixing, still helping. The amounts got smaller, the needs didn't. Then Ruth found an entry dated 3 years before Earl died, her own name. Ruth called today, sounded tired. That husband of hers is spending again. New car, new suit, always something new. She says she's fine, but she's not fine. I can hear it in her voice, the way she talks around things instead of about them. She gets that from me, I suppose. Stubborn like her mother. I wish she'd come home. I wish she'd come home and let me teach her to change oil again and drink coffee that's too strong and sit on the porch and watch the trucks go by. But she won't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I just hope she knows the door is open. Ruth closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. The station was dark now. Through the window, she could see stars appearing above the ridgeline, more than she'd seen in decades of suburban living. The mountain was utterly quiet. No traffic, no neighbors, no television murmuring through walls. She sat on the floor of her father's gas station, holding the record of a life lived in service to others, and understood for the first time that Earl Macklin hadn't just been pumping gas for 40 years. He'd been holding an entire valley together with his bare hands, one small kindness at a time, and he'd never said a word about it to anyone. The station was dark, and Ruth was alone, and the crossword puzzle on the counter was still unfinished. But somewhere between the last page of the journal and the first star above the ridge, a thought took shape that hadn't been there when she walked through the door. She wasn't going to sell this place. Ruth woke to birdsong and the smell of dust. Pale morning light came through the apartment window, landing on the bare mattress where she'd slept in her clothes. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Then the ceiling came into focus, water-stained and low, and she remembered. She washed her face in the bathroom sink and brushed her teeth with a finger and some of Earl's expired toothpaste. In the small kitchen, she found a can of coffee in the cabinet, still sealed with a plastic lid. She smelled it, stale, but not ruined. The 2-burner stove worked on the second try, and she heated water in a dented saucepan because there was no kettle. She carried her coffee downstairs and walked the property. The repair bay was in better shape than the main building. Earl had built it himself in the 70s, poured the concrete floor, hung the doors, 2 bays, one with a hydraulic lift that was probably still functional. His tools hung on a pegboard that covered the entire back wall, organized by size and type, each one outlined in black marker so you'd know if something was missing. Wrenches, sockets, screwdrivers, pliers. The rubber grip on his favorite ratchet was worn smooth from use. Everything was dusty but intact. Earl took care of his tools the way other men took care of their cars. Ruth ran her hand along the workbench. Her fingers found the groove she'd carved into the wood when she was 9, dragging a flathead screwdriver while Earl wasn't looking. He'd found it the next day and shook his head. "Now the bench has character," he'd said. In the corner of the bay stood a green metal filing cabinet, the heavy 4-drawer kind. She tried the top drawer. Locked. She went back to the lockbox and tried the keys she'd found. The smallest one, brass and flat, opened every drawer. Inside were folders. Dozens of them, organized alphabetically by family name, each one containing handwritten notes in Earl's careful script. But these weren't just the financial records from the journal. They were follow-ups, progress reports on the people he'd helped. Hendricks, Tom paid back $50 in June. Baby girl, healthy, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Named her Rose after his mother. Don't mention the rest of the debt. Dunbar, Carol's oldest, got into community college. Gave her $200 for books. She tried to refuse. Left it in the glove box of her car. Sutter, Jim's roof held through the winter. Patched the south side myself in October. He doesn't know. Thinks the landlord fixed it. Ruth sat on a milk crate and read folder after folder. Earl hadn't just lent money. He'd tracked the lives of these families for decades, checking in without them knowing, fixing things they couldn't afford to fix. A man who barely made enough to cover his own bills had spent his life quietly making sure his neighbors didn't fall through the cracks. She was still reading when she heard tires on gravel. Through the bay door, she saw an old Chevy truck pulling up to the station. A man climbed out, heavy-set and slow, wearing a plaid flannel shirt and a cap with a feed store logo. He stood in front of the building, hands on his hips, staring at the cracked windows and the kudzu-covered wall. Ruth stepped out of the bay. "Morning," she called. The man turned. His face was deeply lined, sun-darkened, with white stubble along his jaw. He squinted at her for a long moment, and then his expression changed. His eyes widened and he took off his cap. "I'll be damned," he said. "You're Earl's girl." Ruth Macklin, Hank Dawson. He extended a rough, thick-fingered hand. "I live 2 miles down the mountain. Your daddy and I played cards every Thursday for I don't know how long." "I remember," Ruth said. "You used to bring corn from your garden." Hank grinned. "Still do. Though there's nobody to bring it to anymore." He looked at the station, then back at Ruth. "What brings you up here? Haven't seen a soul at this place since Earl passed." Ruth considered how to answer. She could have said she was assessing the property for sale. She could have deflected with something polite and vague. Instead, she told the truth. "My husband divorced me. He got the house and everything in it. This is all I have left." Hank nodded slowly. He didn't offer sympathy or ask questions. He walked back to his truck and returned with a thermos and 2 ceramic mugs. "Well then," he said, pouring coffee. "You'll need good coffee, not whatever ancient can you found in Earl's cabinet." They sat on overturned buckets on the cracked concrete apron in front of the station, drinking Hank's coffee, which was strong and hot and better than anything Ruth had tasted in months. "Tell me about him," Ruth said. "Tell me the things he didn't tell me." Hank sipped his coffee and studied the mountains. "Your daddy was a complicated man in a simple way. Worked hard, kept his head down, didn't talk much about himself, but he had a thing about people. Couldn't stand to see someone struggle if he could do something about it." I found his journal behind the counter. Hank's eyebrows rose. He wrote it down. Everything. Every family he helped, every loan, every repair he did for free. Hank shook his head, smiling. "That stubborn fool. Never told a living soul what he was doing. I only knew because I caught him once loading groceries into the Sutter family's truck at midnight. He said he was reorganizing inventory. Reorganizing it right into their back seat." Ruth laughed. It surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that. Sudden and unguarded. "Your daddy never turned away a soul who needed help," Hank continued. "Said it was cheaper than church and did more good." He paused, turning the mug in his hands. "Folks around here still talk about him. Not big speeches or anything, just quiet things. Someone will mention that their lights stayed on because of Earl, or that their car ran another winter because Earl fixed it for nothing. Why didn't he tell me any of this?" Hank looked at her. "You know why. Because Earl didn't think it was anything special. He thought it was just what you did when you lived somewhere and had 2 hands and a set of wrenches. He didn't think it needed a name or a medal or a conversation. He just did it." They sat in silence for a while. A truck passed on Route 11, the first vehicle Ruth had seen since arriving. The driver lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in the mountain greeting she'd forgotten about. "Earl Macklin died owing nothing to anyone and being owed by everyone," Hank said quietly. "That was the richest a man could be." Hank left mid-morning with a promise to come back the next day with lumber for the porch railing. Ruth spent the rest of the morning cleaning. She swept the main room, washed the windows with newspaper and vinegar she found under the sink, and scrubbed the counter until the wood grain showed through decades of grime. She unstacked the shelves behind the counter and wiped each one. At noon, a woman Ruth didn't recognize pulled up in a minivan and left a casserole on the front step with a note that said, Welcome home, Earl's daughter. Ruth didn't know who she was or how she knew Ruth was here. Mountain news traveled without wires. By afternoon, 3 more people had stopped by. An elderly man who left a stack of firewood by the side of the building. A couple who brought cleaning supplies in a plastic bin. A teenage girl who dropped off a bag of groceries, waved shyly, and drove away before Ruth could thank her. Each one left the same message, in different words but with identical meaning. Earl helped us once. We're glad you're here. Ruth carried the groceries upstairs and put them away. Bread, eggs, milk, canned soup, a bag of apples. She made a sandwich and ate it standing at the apartment window looking down at the gas pumps. They were rusted and locked, the hoses cracked, the price displays frozen. Getting them working again would cost money she didn't have. But the repair bay was functional. The tools were all there, and she was Earl's daughter, which meant she knew her way around an engine, even if she hadn't touched one in decades. She went back downstairs and spent the afternoon in the bay, testing the hydraulic lift, checking the air compressor, organizing tools. Her hands remembered what her mind had tried to forget: the weight of a socket wrench, the resistance of a rusted bolt, the satisfaction of hearing a stuck mechanism break free. Late in the afternoon, with the sun dropping behind the western ridge, Ruth heard an engine struggling on the road. She stepped outside and saw a white pickup truck limping toward the station, steam rising from under the hood. It rolled to a stop, 20 yards past the building, and a young man climbed out. He was maybe 23, lean and sunburned, wearing a gray t-shirt with grease stains on the front. His jeans were torn at the knee and his boots were work-worn. He popped the hood and stared at the engine with the focused expression of someone who understood what he was looking at. Ruth walked over. "Radiator?" The young man looked up, surprised. "Hose blue. Upper one?" He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I've got a spare in the bed, but I don't have tools." "I've got tools," Ruth said. She nodded toward the repair bay. "Pull it in if it'll make it that far." He looked at her, then at the station. His face showed the calculation of someone used to being turned away, the hesitation of a person who'd learned not to accept help because it always came with conditions. "I can pay for the bay time," he said. "I didn't ask for money. I said pull it in." His name was Jesse Rowan. He drove the truck into the bay and had the old hose off in 6 minutes. Ruth found a replacement in Earl's stockroom that was close enough to work with a couple of extra clamps. She watched Jesse install it. His hands moved with the quick, precise confidence of someone who'd been working on engines since childhood. "Where'd you learn to wrench?" she asked. "My grandmother's boyfriend had a shop in Boone. I spent every summer there until I was 16. He tightened the last clamp and stepped back. "Haven't worked in a shop since. Last 3 places I tried didn't work out." Ruth didn't ask why. She could see enough in his face to fill in the story. Young, no family support, probably sleeping in that truck. The kind of person Earl would have noticed immediately. "I'm reopening this station," she said. The words came out before she'd fully decided they were true. "I need someone who can turn a wrench." Jesse looked at her steadily. "You don't know me. I know you replace that hose faster than most mechanics with twice your experience. That's enough for today." He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He poured coolant into the radiator, started the engine, and listened to it run. Satisfied, he closed the hood and wiped his hands on a rag from Earl's workbench. "I'll think about it," he said. "Come back tomorrow if you decide," Ruth told him. "I'll have coffee on." Jesse drove off down Route 11. Ruth watched his taillights disappear around the curve, then went back inside. The station was quiet again. She sat behind the counter with Earl's journal and the bundle of letters she hadn't finished reading. She untied the twine and sorted through the remaining envelopes. Most were the same thank you notes from families Earl had helped, but the last envelope was different. It was sealed, not opened, addressed in Earl's handwriting, and it had her name on it. Ruth was all it said in his careful block letters, the same ones that filled the crossword puzzles and the journal and the labels on every tool in the repair bay. Ruth slid her finger under the flap and pulled out 2 sheets of yellow legal paper folded in thirds. "Dear Ruth," it began, "if you're reading this, you found your way back. I always knew you would." She leaned against the counter and held the letter close to the light. "I wrote this on a Tuesday in October. The leaves are turning and business is slow, which means I have too much time to think. That's dangerous for an old man. I want you to know something about this station. It isn't worth much on paper. A building inspector would condemn half of it, and a real estate agent would call it a tear down. but it's worth everything to the people who depend on it. I don't mean the gas or the repairs, though those matter. I mean the fact that it's here, that someone is behind the counter, that the coffee is on and the light is on and the door is open. I kept the books you'll find in the filing cabinet and behind the register. I wrote it all down because I wanted someone to know what this place meant, even if that someone turned out to be nobody. But I hoped it would be you. I know about Dennis. I've known for a long time. You think you hit it well, but a father sees what a father sees. He's not a bad man, Ruth. He's just a man who measures everything in dollars and thinks that's the same as value. Someday you'll see the difference. I hope it doesn't cost you too much to learn it. This station is yours, not because it's worth money, but because you're the only person I trust to understand what it was for. Don't sell it. Don't let anyone tell you it's worthless. And if you can, keep the coffee on. That matters more than you think. The letter was signed with just his name, Earl. Ruth folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. She set it on the counter beside his reading glasses and the unfinished crossword. 3 objects from a man who had been gone for over a decade, and yet the station felt more full of him now than it had when she walked through the door. Outside, the last light drained from the sky. The mountains turned from blue to black, and the stars came out in their thousands, the way they only do where the nearest streetlight is 10 miles away. Ruth locked the front door, climbed the stairs, and lay down on the bare mattress. She was 58, broke, divorced, and sleeping above an abandoned gas station on a road most people had forgotten existed. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she knew exactly what she was going to do next. Jesse's truck pulled into the lot at 7 the next morning. Ruth was already downstairs, sweeping the front apron with a broom she'd found in the stockroom. She set it against the wall and waited. He climbed out and stood for a moment, looking at the building. Then he walked over. "Coffee's on," Ruth said. "You said it would be." She handed him a mug. He took it and drank without asking what was in it. "I'll work a week," he said. "See how it goes." Fair enough. That was how it started. A mug of coffee and a week to see how it went. Ruth had made a list on the back of one of Earl's old receipts. Broken windows, porch railing, gutters, kudzu, water damage in the south wall, pump islands. The list filled the back of the receipt and kept going on to the counter. Jesse studied it. "You planning to rebuild the whole place? Just the parts that are falling down?" He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to one Ruth had seen from him. They divided the work without discussion. Jesse took the repair bay, testing the compressor, bleeding the hydraulic lines on the lift, sorting parts in the stockroom. Ruth tackled the main building. She pulled the kudzu off the south wall by hand, filling a wheelbarrow behind the building until the pile was taller than she was. The vine had worked deep into the mortar between the cinder blocks, and pulling it free was slow, stubborn work that left her hands raw by noon. Hank showed up at 9 with a truck bed full of lumber and a toolbox he needed both hands to carry. He parked, climbed out, and surveyed the front porch with his arms crossed. "Railing's rotten," he said. "I noticed. I'll have it done by lunch." He wasn't bragging. He finished by 11:30. Ruth brought him water and watched him test the new railing, leaning his full weight against it. The wood was fresh-cut pine, pale and clean against the weathered porch floor. Earl would have used cedar, Hank said. Earl could afford cedar. Hank grinned. "Pine'll do." That was the rhythm of those first days. Ruth and Jesse worked from sunrise until they lost the light, and Hank appeared most mornings with materials and experience. He didn't ask to be paid. Ruth tried once, and he looked at her like she'd insulted him. "Earl helped me reshingle my roof back in '98, he said. "Took him 3 days. Wouldn't take a dime. Told me I could buy him a steak when I won the lottery. He hammered a nail into the porch step he was replacing. Never won the lottery. So this is the steak." Jesse replaced the cracked front window and caulked the frames on the rest. Ruth painted the door and window trim dark green, the same shade Earl had always used, from a can she found in the stockroom. Jesse got the furnace running after 2 afternoons of cleaning out bird nests and replacing a corroded ignition switch. "That furnace should have been condemned a long time ago," he told Ruth, "but it's stubborn." "Runs in the family," she said. The pumps were the biggest problem. The underground tanks needed inspection, and the pumps themselves were relics from another era. Ruth called every fuel company within 50 miles. Most of them hung up when she described the location. A station on a road nobody drove anymore didn't justify the cost. The 4th company she called was run by a man named Grady, Earl Macklin's daughter. he said on the phone. "Your daddy kept my trucks running when I was just starting out. Wouldn't charge me full price because he said a man trying to build something shouldn't be punished for it." Grady sent a crew the following week. They inspected the tanks, flushed the lines, and installed 2 new pump heads. Ruth signed a fuel contract with terms she could barely manage if enough cars stopped. It was a gamble. Everything about this was a gamble. The first customer came on a Thursday. An older woman in a white sedan pulled up to the pump island, rolled down her window, and stared. "Are you open?" "We are." The woman got out slowly, holding the car door for balance. She looked at the station, then at Ruth, and her eyes filled. "I used to come here every week when Earl was alive," she said. "He always checked my tires and never charged me." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "I didn't expect anyone to be here." Ruth filled her tank and checked her tires. When the woman reached for her wallet to pay for the tire check, Ruth waved her off. "Your daddy did the same thing," the woman said quietly. "Exact same wave." After that, the customers came steadily. Not many, but enough. People who lived in the valley and remembered the station when it was Earl's. They came for gas and stayed for the porch. Ruth bought a proper coffee maker with the last of the lockbox money and set it on a table just inside the front door, in the same spot where Earl had kept his. Hank told her she was going to burn through a pound of coffee a week. "Earl went through too," Ruth said. "Earl had more visitors. Give it time." A man drove 45 minutes each way to get his oil changed at the station instead of the shop 10 minutes from his house. A woman brought her teenage son to meet Ruth because she wanted him to know what Earl had done for their family. An elderly couple who hadn't made the drive up the mountain in months came just to sit on the porch and drink coffee and tell Ruth about the time Earl fixed their truck on Christmas Eve. He wouldn't let them pay because he said it was technically a holiday and he didn't work holidays, so there was nothing to charge for. Jesse settled into the bay with a focus Ruth hadn't expected. He arrived before she came downstairs every morning and stayed until the light faded. He kept the tools clean, returning each one to its outlined spot on the pegboard. When he didn't know how to fix something, he said so. When he did know, he worked with a quiet confidence that reminded her of watching Earl. She paid him from the fuel sales and repair fees. It wasn't much. He didn't complain. "You need a mattress for that room upstairs," she told him one afternoon, after she saw him stretching his back beside the lift. He looked at her. "The spare room. It has a frame but no mattress. I'll find one. I'm fine in the truck." "Nobody's fine sleeping in a truck. Jesse, take the room." He was quiet for a while. Then he nodded and went back to work. Ruth found a mattress at a yard sale that weekend for $15. Jesse carried it upstairs without a word. Ruth ran the station the way she believed Earl would have. When a man came in with a fan belt screaming and his wallet already out, she charged him for the belt and nothing for Jesse's labor. When a young mother pulled up with her tank near empty and a worried look that had nothing to do with the car, Ruth filled it and told her to pay when she could. When an elderly couple asked about brake pads and Ruth could see the math behind their eyes, she quoted them half the price and covered the difference herself. She wasn't trying to be generous. She was trying to be useful. There was a difference, and Earl had understood it better than anyone she'd ever known. One evening, sitting on the porch with Hank, while Jesse closed up the bay, Ruth said something she hadn't planned on saying. "I didn't come back to save this place. I came back because I had nowhere else to go." The saving part happened on its own. Hank sipped his coffee and watched the ridge change color in the fading light. That's usually how it works. If you've made it this far into Ruth's story, hit subscribe because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Ruth reopened the station. White, heavy stock, with a return address she recognized immediately. Felton and Associates. She opened it at the counter, standing next to Earl's reading glasses and the half-finished crossword. She read it twice because the language was dense, but the meaning underneath was plain. Dennis was filing a motion to include the gas station in the marital asset division. His lawyers claimed Ruth had failed to disclose the property's true value during settlement. They cited a planned state highway expansion that would increase the land's assessment significantly. They wanted the court to reopen the settlement and either award Dennis his share or force a sale. Ruth set the letter down. Her hands were steady, but her stomach wasn't. She read it a third time, looking for a weakness in the argument, some loophole or exception that made the threat less real. She didn't find one. She thought about calling a lawyer. She didn't know any lawyers, and the ones she could find would cost money she didn't have. The fuel sales barely covered the contract payments and Jesse's wages. The lockbox was empty. She couldn't afford to fight this. That night, Connie called. Ruth hadn't spoken to her daughter in over a week. Their conversations had grown shorter since Ruth moved to the station, brief calls where both of them said less than they felt. "Mom, I heard about the lawyer's letter." "How?" "Dad told me." Of course he did. Dennis was building his case before the case even started, lining up allies, framing Ruth as unreasonable. He built things for a living. Houses, portfolios, arguments, and he was good at all of them. "He says the property is worth more than what was declared," Connie said. "He says there's a highway coming through." "There's always a highway coming through somewhere, Connie. Doesn't mean it's coming here. Mom, listen to me. If the property is worth something, why not sell? Take the money. Get an apartment. Start over properly." "I'm not selling." "Why not?" "Because this isn't about money." Connie went quiet. Ruth could hear her breathing, the slow, measured kind that meant she was holding something back. "Mom, I'm worried about you. I know. You're living in a building that should probably be condemned, working a gas pump, and now Dad is taking you to court. How is any of this okay?" Jesse fixed the furnace. "The building is fine." "Who is Jesse?" "He works here." "You hired someone? With what money?" "Connie, I'm handling it." "That's what you always say, and then Dad handles it." The words hit harder than Connie probably intended. Ruth closed her eyes. She could have told her the truth, that Dennis had never handled anything except his own comfort. That handling was just a polite word for control. That Connie had grown up inside Dennis's version of the world and didn't know there were other versions. She didn't say any of it. "I love you," Ruth said. "I'll call you this weekend." She hung up and sat in the dark station. The mountains were black against a sky thick with stars. She got up and made a fresh pot of coffee, because that was what you did. You made coffee and kept the light on and waited for morning. Dennis came 3 days later. Ruth heard the engine before she saw the car. Deep, smooth, expensive. She stepped out of the bay and watched a silver SUV pull up to the pump island. New model, polished, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most families in the valley earned in a year. Dennis climbed out. 61 and looking younger, tanned and trim in a navy polo and pressed khakis. He put on sunglasses and studied the station the way he studied properties before buying them. Assessing the bones. "Ruth," he said. "Dennis." He walked toward her with his hands in his pockets, taking his time. Jesse was in the bay, visible through the open door. Hank had gone home an hour before. "Nice little project," Dennis said. He looked at the fresh paint, the new railing. The sign Hank had rehung. "Your father's place. I think I drove out here once, when we were dating." "You didn't come to talk about my father." Dennis took off his sunglasses and studied her. She recognized the expression. He was reading the room, measuring her, calculating the fastest way to what he wanted. "I came because I thought we could talk before the lawyers make this ugly," he said. "The property is undervalued, Ruth. You know it, and I know it. That highway expansion is going to pass within a mile of here. This land will be worth 10 times what it appraised for. And you want your share. I want what's fair." Fair. The word Dennis used the way other men used a handshake. It sounded reasonable until you looked at the terms. "You got the house," Ruth said. "The savings. The retirement accounts. You got everything except a gas station your own lawyers called a teardown. And now you want that too. I want what the court should have considered. If the property appreciates, you'd be profiting from an asset that should have been divided. This property was my father's. He left it to me in his will. It was never part of our marriage. That's for the court to decide." Ruth looked at him. He was standing in front of Earl's gas station in clothes that cost more than her monthly fuel bill, talking about fairness. "You're right, Dennis. It is worth something. Just not the kind of something you understand." He stared at her. She could see the rehearsed conversation falling apart behind his eyes, the script going sideways. He had expected her to fold. He had driven 4 hours expecting the Ruth, he remembered, the one who signed where Felton pointed and agreed because agreeing was easier than fighting. That Ruth was gone. "I'll see you in court," Dennis said. He put his sunglasses on, walked to the SUV, and pulled out of the lot. The gravel popped under his tires. Ruth watched until the silver disappeared around the curve. Then she went inside. Jesse was at the workbench, holding a socket wrench he hadn't been using. "That your ex-husband?" "That's him. He always like that." "He wasn't always. That's what makes it hard." Jesse set the wrench down. "You going to be all right?" Ruth looked at the letter on the counter next to Earl's glasses and the unfinished crossword. "I don't have a lawyer. I don't have money for one, so I honestly don't know." She locked up the station that night and climbed the stairs. She lay on the mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about the families in Earl's journal who had faced worse than this with less than this, and the man who had quietly made sure they didn't face it alone. Earl had always known what to do next. Ruth didn't. But she wasn't leaving. Ruth was behind the counter the next morning when Hank walked in. She hadn't slept much. The legal letter sat where she'd left it, next to Earl's glasses. Hank looked at the letter, then at her. "Heard Dennis was here yesterday." "Mountain news," Ruth said. "Fastest thing in the valley." Hank poured himself coffee and settled onto the stool beside the counter. "What's he want?" "The station. Or his share of it. His lawyers think the property is undervalued because of some highway expansion." Hank set his mug down. "They've been talking about that highway for as long as I can remember. Never happens. But that won't stop a lawyer from billing hours over it. I can barely afford the coffee." Hank was quiet for a moment, turning the mug in his hands. "There's a woman in Barton," he said, "retired attorney. Quit practicing 5 or 6 years back, moved up from Richmond. Her daughter was sick when she was little. Needed surgery the insurance wouldn't cover. Ruth waited. Earl paid for it, $3,200, took it out of the station's earnings. Never told her where it came from. But she found out. People around here always find out. You think she'd help? I think if you tell her you're Earl Macklin's daughter and your ex-husband is trying to take what Earl left you, she'll be here by tomorrow." Hank called her that afternoon. The attorney arrived the next morning in a gray sedan, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen every courtroom in Virginia. She was in her late 60s, tall and straight-backed with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Ruth met her on the porch. "You're Earl's daughter," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Ruth Macklin, the attorney, shook her hand with a firm, dry grip. "Hank told me what's happening. I'd like to hear it from you." They sat at the counter with the legal letter between them. The attorney read it slowly, turning pages with a calm that came from having read thousands of documents, just like it. When she finished, she set her glasses on the counter beside Earl's. "This is a nuisance claim," she said. "Your ex-husband's lawyers know it, and he probably knows it too. But nuisance claims work because most people can't afford to fight them. Pressure until you fold. That's the strategy. Can he win? Not if the property was never marital. Was the station ever in both your names? No. It was Earl's. He left it to me when he died. Did you and your husband ever use the property? Make improvements? Pay taxes on it jointly? Dennis never set foot in this station until 3 days ago. I haven't paid the taxes on it in years. The county sent notices, but the amounts were small and I just let them pile up. I wasn't paying attention. That's actually helpful. If neither of you maintained, improved, or used the property during the marriage, it stays separate. Your ex-husband has no claim." His lawyers cited a highway expansion. The attorney waved a hand. Speculative future value isn't grounds for reopening a settlement. They'd need to prove the value was deliberately concealed at the time of the divorce. Was it? His own lawyers appraised it at $14,000. They let me keep it without a fight. Then they assessed it and dismissed it. That's their problem, not yours. She stood and collected the papers. "I'll need the original deed and any inheritance documents. Do you have them? My father kept everything. Then, let's find them." Ruth led her to the repair bay, to the green filing cabinet where Earl's records lived. They went through it drawer by drawer. The attorney was methodical, pulling folders, separating what mattered from what didn't. Ruth found the original deed in the bottom drawer in a manila envelope labeled "Property" in Earl's handwriting. Inside was the deed from Earl's father, dated 1971, transferring the land and building to Earl Robert Macklin. Below it was a copy of Earl's will, witnessed and notarized, leaving the property solely to Ruth Ann Macklin. The attorney held both documents up to the light coming through the bay door. "This is clean," she said. "The property passed from your grandfather to your father, and from your father to you. It was never jointly held, never commingled with marital assets. Never improved with marital funds. She set the papers on the workbench. His motion will be dismissed. You're sure? I practiced law for a long time before I retired. I'm sure. Ruth leaned against the workbench. The relief came slowly, loosening something in her shoulders that had been tight since the envelope arrived. What do I owe you? She asked. The attorney looked at her. Your father paid for my daughter's surgery when I couldn't. He never asked for anything. He never even told me it was him. She picked up her briefcase from the workbench. There's nothing you owe me, Ruth. This one was paid for a long time ago. She left her card on the counter and drove away. Ruth stood on the porch and watched the gray sedan disappear down the mountain road, and she stood there a while after it was gone. That afternoon, Jesse was in the bay, reorganizing the filing cabinet when the sound of his work stopped. Ruth was wiping down the front windows and almost didn't notice. But the silence had a weight to it that was different from his usual concentration. She walked to the bay door. Jesse was sitting on the milk crate Ruth had used the first time she read through the folders. He had one open on his lap. He was staring at it. Jesse. He didn't look up. Ruth walked over and stood beside him. The folder was labeled Rowan in Earl's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a note in the same careful block letters that filled the journal and labeled every tool on the wall. Clara Rowan, surgery fund, $3,200. Heart valve replacement, August 1994. Sent through the doctor's office as anonymous donation. Don't let her know where it came from. Jesse's hands were shaking. He closed the folder and pressed it flat against his knees. My grandmother, he said. His voice was tight but steady, the voice of someone holding himself together by will alone. She had heart surgery when I was a baby. She always said someone paid for it. Anonymous. She never found out who. He looked up at Ruth. She told me that story every time I visited. Said whoever paid for that surgery was the reason our whole family existed. She looked for that person for the rest of her life. Ruth sat on the concrete floor beside the milk crate. She didn't say anything. Some moments needed silence more than words. I didn't know she'd ever been to this station, Jesse said. She lived in Boone. That's 40 miles from here. Earl drove to Boone sometimes, Ruth said. He told me he was visiting a friend. Jesse folded the page carefully and put it back in the folder. He sat holding it on his lap, looking at Earl's tools hanging on the pegboard in their outlined shapes. He never met me, Jesse said. Earl never knew I'd exist. But the reason I'm alive, the reason my grandmother survived, the reason any of us are here, is because a man running a gas station on a road nobody uses decided to pay for a stranger's surgery. That's who he was, Ruth said. Jesse nodded. He stood up, returned the folder to the cabinet, and went back to work without another word. But Ruth noticed he stayed later than usual that night, and when he cleaned Earl's tools before locking up, he handled each one the way you handle something that belongs to someone you wish you'd known. Connie arrived on a Saturday, unannounced. Ruth was on the porch with two regulars when the rental car pulled into the lot. She recognized her daughter through the windshield. Connie sat in the car for a full minute before getting out. She was wearing a white blouse and tailored pants that belonged in a design office, not a gravel lot on a mountain road. She walked toward the station with the careful steps of someone entering a place she'd already decided was a mistake. Mom, she said. Ruth stood up from the porch bench. Connie, you didn't call. I wanted to see for myself. Ruth knew what that meant. Connie had come to measure the damage, to build a case for whatever intervention she'd been planning since their last phone call. Come inside, Ruth said. I'll pour you a cup. Connie followed her in and stopped just inside the door. The station looked nothing like what she'd expected. Ruth could see it in her face. The clean windows, the stocked shelves, the coffee maker by the door, Earl's glasses on the counter beside the crossword. The place was old and worn and plain, but it was working. Jesse walked in from the bay, wiping his hands on a rag. He nodded at Connie. This is Jesse, Ruth said. He runs the repair bay. Ma'am, Jesse said, and went back to work. Connie sat on the stool behind the counter and looked around the room. She'd been here once as a child and couldn't remember it. It's not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Something I could point to and say, Mom, this isn't working. Ruth poured 2 mugs and set one in front of her daughter. And now, Connie wrapped both hands around the mug. Now I don't know what to say. They sat in silence for a while. Through the window, Hank's truck pulled in with a load of firewood. He waved at the building without stopping, stacked the wood along the side wall, and drove off. "Who was that?" Connie asked. "Hank, your grandfather's closest friend. He just shows up with firewood every week." Connie stared into her coffee. "Dad says you're being unreasonable. Holding on to this place out of spite. What do you think?" Connie looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. "I think you're different. I don't know what happened here, but you're not the same person who walked out of that courtroom." Ruth let the words sit between them. "I sided with Dad," Connie said, "during the divorce. You know that." "I know. It was easier. He had the answers. He always had answers. And you just agreed with everything. I didn't respect that." The words landed. Ruth felt them settle. She didn't flinch. "You were right not to," Ruth said. Connie looked surprised. "I spent a long time agreeing because it was easier," Ruth said. "That's not something to respect, but I'm done agreeing." She poured her daughter more coffee and let the quiet do the rest. They sat together behind the counter while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and for the first time in longer than Ruth could measure, the silence between them wasn't distance, it was rest. Connie left the next morning. She hugged Ruth at the car, held on longer than usual, and said, "Call me after the hearing." The hearing was on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after Dennis filed his motion. Ruth drove to the county courthouse in the same truck she'd driven out of the divorce. The attorney met her on the steps, wearing a Navy suit and carrying a folder with 3 documents inside: the original deed, Earl's will, and a chain of title summary from the clerk's office. The courtroom was smaller than the one where Ruth had signed her divorce papers. Dennis sat in the front row with Felton beside him. Charcoal suit, same as the one he wore to board meetings and client dinners. He didn't look at her. The hearing lasted 20 minutes. The attorney presented the deed, the will, and the chain of title. She explained how the property had passed from Earl's father to Earl, and from Earl to Ruth, never jointly held, never improved with marital funds. The tax records confirmed Dennis had never paid $1 toward the property. His own legal team had appraised it during the divorce and dismissed it as negligible. This property was separate before the marriage and separate at dissolution, the attorney said. There is no legal basis for reopening the settlement. The judge reviewed the documents. He asked Felton for a rebuttal. Felton shifted in his seat and said something about potential future value and equitable distribution, but there was nothing behind the words. The judge shook his head. "Motion denied," he said. "The property was never marital. This matter is closed." Dennis sat very still. Felton gathered his papers. Ruth exhaled. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm on the courthouse steps. Ruth was walking to her truck when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Dennis was standing on the bottom step, his jacket over one arm. He looked different. The confidence was still there, but something behind it had shifted. He seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "When did you become this person?" he asked. Ruth looked at him. The man she'd married at 25. The man who had built a career on knowing the value of things and missed the value of everything that mattered. "I always was," she said. "You just never looked." She walked to the truck and drove home. The word came without effort, and she let it stay. Home. The sun was low when she pulled into the lot. Jessie was closing the bay doors. Hank had gone for the day, but fresh firewood was stacked against the wall. The coffee pot inside was still warm. Ruth walked behind the counter to the breaker panel. Earl had wired the building himself, and the panel was labeled in his handwriting. She found the switch marked "Sign" and flipped it. Through the front window she could see the glow. Earl's hand-painted sign, lit for the first time since he died. The letters were faded but readable against the darkening sky. Macklin Gas and Service. Jessie came around the corner of the building and looked up at it. "Looks good," he said. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched the sign glow against the coming night. It wasn't bright, it wasn't new, but it was on. 3 months later, the dogwoods along the mountain road were blooming. White blossoms pressed against the green canopy, and the air smelled like warm earth and new growth. Spring had come to the valley the way it always did, slowly and then all at once. The station was alive. The pumps ran every day. Jessie handled most of the repair work, and Ruth had stopped counting the cars because there were enough. The coffee pot stayed on from 6 in the morning until whoever left last turned it off, which was usually Hank, who had developed a habit of sitting on the porch until well after dark. Jessie had changed, not in any way you'd notice from the outside unless you'd known him at the beginning. He still arrived early and stayed late. He still worked with the same quiet focus. But there was a steadiness to him now that hadn't been there before. He'd enrolled in an online certification program for mechanics, studying on a used laptop Ruth had bought with money from the station's earnings. He sat at the counter after hours, reading about diesel diagnostics and fuel injection systems, taking notes in a composition book with the same careful handwriting Earl used to have. When Ruth mentioned the similarity, Jesse shrugged. "Good handwriting is good handwriting," he said. The bay stayed busy. Word had spread through the valley that the station was open again and that the mechanic was fast, honest, and fair. People drove past newer shops to bring their cars to Jesse because they trusted a place with Earl's name on it. Jesse understood that without being told. He never cut corners, never quoted more than the work was worth, never turned someone away because the job was too small. Ruth watched him one morning through the bay door, walking a nervous teenager through her first oil change. He was patient, explaining each step, letting her hold the wrench and feel the bolt loosen. "You're good at this," Ruth said afterward. "At what?" "Teaching." Jesse looked uncomfortable. "I'm just showing her what goes where. That's what teaching is." The porch had become a gathering place. Regulars showed up in the late afternoon. With lawn chairs they left folded against the building between visits. They drank Ruth's coffee and traded stories about the weather, the road, their trucks, their families. An older man brought a checkerboard and left it on the porch railing. It stayed there, and by the end of the first week, there was a running tournament that nobody kept official score of, but everyone took seriously. Ruth learned their names, their families, their troubles. She learned who was behind on bills, who had just gotten a grandchild, who needed a brake job but couldn't swing the cost. She kept this information the way Earl had, in her head and in her actions, quietly. The man with the bad brakes came to pick up his car and found it fixed, the bill listing only the cost of the pads. A woman whose husband had recently left found an envelope of grocery money in her glove compartment. Ruth didn't announce what she was doing. Nobody asked. The valley absorbed her generosity the way it had absorbed Earl's, as part of how things worked. Connie came back in May, and this time she brought her children. A boy of 9 and a girl of 6, both wearing city clothes and wide eyes. They climbed out of the rental car and looked at the station, at the mountains, at the gravel lot, and a world entirely different from their own. "This is where your great-grandpa Earl worked," Connie told them. The boys studied the building. "It's small." "Big enough," Ruth said from the doorway. She took them through the station first, showed them the counter, the reading glasses, the crossword. She opened the lockbox, empty now except for the original keys, and let them hold the brass one that opened the filing cabinet. The girl was fascinated by the cash register, the old mechanical kind with buttons that clicked. Ruth let her ring up an imaginary sale. Then she took them to the bay. Jesse was under a truck when they walked in. He slid out on the creeper, wiped his hands, and said hello with the careful politeness of someone who hadn't spent much time around children. Ruth showed them Earl's tools. She lifted the boy up so he could see the pegboard, the outlines around each wrench and socket and screwdriver. She let the girl hold a flashlight while she explained how to check tire pressure on the truck parked inside. "Press it here," she told the boy, showing him the gauge. "And this number tells you if there's enough air. What if there isn't? Then you add some. Compressor's right there." The boy pressed the gauge to the valve stem. 32, he read. "Perfect, you just did your first tire check." He grinned. It was the same grin Ruth had worn at his age, in this same bay, learning the same things from Earl. She felt it in her chest, a fullness that had nothing to do with air and everything to do with time, folding over on itself. Connie watched from the bay door. She didn't say anything. Ruth could see her daughter's face, and what was on it wasn't worry anymore. It was recognition. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep on the couch upstairs, Ruth and Connie sat on the porch. The sky was clear and full of stars. "I was wrong," Connie said. "About what?" "All of it, this place. You." She turned her mug in her hands. "Dad." Ruth didn't push. She'd learned that from Earl. "You let people arrive at the truth on their own. When they get there, you pour them another cup." "He called me last week," Connie said. Sounded different. "Choir asked about you." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you're doing better than anyone expected. That the station is running and people come from all over the valley." Connie paused. "I told him you turned into someone he never imagined you could be. And I said that's because he never tried to imagine it." Ruth reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "He wasn't a bad man, Connie. He just measured the wrong things." Hank came by the next morning with something wrapped in brown paper under his arm. He walked in, set it on the counter, and slid it toward Ruth. "Found this in my garage," he said. "Been sitting in a box." Ruth unwrapped it. A framed photograph, slightly faded, behind dusty glass. Earl and a young Ruth standing in front of the station. Ruth was maybe 6, wearing overalls and a wide grin. Earl stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder, squinting into the sun. The sign above them was freshly painted. The pumps were shining. Ruth held the photograph and looked at it for a long time. "He gave me a copy after he took it," Hank said. "Told me it was the best picture he ever took. Said it was the only time both of you looked exactly like who you were supposed to be." Ruth carried the photo behind the counter and hung it on the wall next to Earl's reading glasses and the crossword. 3 objects from a man who had been gone for over a decade, and a photograph that proved he'd known who she was before she knew it herself. The days found a rhythm. Ruth woke early, made coffee, opened the station. Jessie came downstairs and went to the bay. The first customer pulled in by 7:30. Ruth worked the counter and the pumps, and between customers she sat on the porch and watched the road, and drank coffee, and listened to the valley doing what it did. It wasn't a big life. It wasn't a wealthy life. It was a useful life, and Ruth had come to understand that usefulness was its own kind of wealth, the kind that didn't show up on balance sheets but held communities together. Late one afternoon, with the sun dropping behind the western ridge, a car Ruth didn't recognize pulled into the lot. A minivan, road dusty, with a cracked taillight. A young woman climbed out, maybe 30, wearing a faded jacket and jeans. 3 children were in the back seat. The youngest was asleep in a car seat. The woman looked at the pumps, then at the station, then at Ruth on the porch. She had the expression Ruth had seen on other faces and in her own mirror. Someone carrying more than she could say. "Could I get some gas?" the woman asked. "Of course." Ruth walked to the pump and filled the tank. "Want me to check the oil while I'm at it?" The woman nodded. Ruth checked the oil, topped off the windshield fluid, and noticed the front left tire was low. She added air without asking. When the pump clicked off, the woman opened her purse and started digging through it. Ruth could see her fingers moving past receipts and loose change. The quick motion of someone counting what they had and hoping it would be enough. "Pay it next time you're through," Ruth said. The woman looked up. "What?" "Next time you drive through. You can pay then. I can't just take." "Sure you can. I'll be here." The woman stared at her. Her eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together hard. "Why?" she asked. Ruth smiled. "My father used to say the same thing." The woman drove away with a full tank and aired up tires and a story she would carry with her. Ruth watched the minivan disappear around the curve and went back inside. She closed up the station at dusk. Jessie had already locked the bay and gone upstairs. Hank's firewood was stacked along the wall. Enough for another week. The coffee pot was off. The checkerboard on the porch railing was set up for tomorrow's game. Ruth turned off the lights, one by one. The front room, the stock room, the counter lamp. She picked up Earl's reading glasses, cleaned them with the hem of her shirt the way she'd done 1,000 times as a girl, and set them back beside the crossword. 27 across was still filled in. 28 across was still blank. She left them that way. She locked the front door with the key her father had turned 10,000 times before her. Through the glass, she could see the sign glowing against the darkening sky, faded, hand-painted and lit. She climbed the stairs to the apartment that smelled like coffee and motor oil and home. She was 58 years old. She was just getting started.